couple days ago, Drew came to my office and asked me if I wanted to give a lecture. Now this was interesting because you actually have the capabilities of actually giving a lecture. But when he said that my last lecture I gave was in 302, intermediate micro, I think dealing with neoclassical stuff. Before I went on medical leave, he figured, and I certainly thought so, that this wasn't the most appropriate place to end one lecturing career. So he asked me if I would give a lecture here, brought along a couple of heavies, Matthew and Brian, to make sure I would agree to this. I think they had baseball bats someplace in the background. Didn't give me much time to prepare something which would pass as a lecture, so this looks fairly rough or jumping or whatever. I apologize. A little bit easier for those who've had my 602, but it still would be perhaps somewhat difficult to follow. Title of the lecture is The Role of Microeconomics and Heterodox Economics, a View from a Micro Theorist. Now, people might have listened for an hour to understand why they would want to of this kind of live, whatever. I think I did with Professor Kelton.
The interview, yeah.
The interview, whatever that thing. Where I hopefully made it very clear that I don't believe in a distinction between micro and macro. It's the system as a whole that we analyze, and we do it from various perspectives. So even though I rant and rave about this silly stuff in macro, talk about micro, that's just because most students, well, virtually all students, come in here with a conception that micro and macro are separate, and that from one's perspective, one is better than the other. And mostly it's macro, because the only micro they get as undergraduates is neoclassical micro, and rightly so. To condemn that stuff as pure nonsense or incoherency is a reasonable position, and therefore, why would anybody want to study it? Only real stuff happens in macro. I can understand that. It's just absolutely wrong, and so students come here with no conception about there's a different way of doing economics as a whole. Now, as I mentioned in that broadcast, the neoclassical approach to this is to make micro and macro coherent with each other. Just because they do it by reducing macro to microeconomics is not a fault. That's certainly the way they can make it coherent. The notion that heterodox economists believe that micro and macro are unrelated, so you have an understanding of the economy as a whole that is incoherent, and they believe this fervently and try to push it, to me is either weak minds or people incapable of thinking. Because you want to be able to talk about things that happen in the city, if you're an urban economist, that in a sense ties in with the economy as a whole. So simultaneously doing a micro-analysis, it has a connection with the economy as a whole or macro. The notion that things can be totally isolated in an interdependent economy is nonsense. And so this is why I rant and rave about getting people not only to look at micro seriously, but in fact discard the concepts of micro and macro. We are just interested in different areas of the economy and how they relate to each other. That's it. Now, obviously, when you go out in the world and have to teach micro and macro, it doesn't make it right. That's the way things are set up. So you need to be able to simultaneously think in those terms and think in terms of the economy as a whole. You always have to know a lot of wrong stuff as well as right stuff. Because knowing wrong stuff can help you understand how thinking gets done and what's going on. So this is why I always insist that if you want to do stuff that is micro, you know neoclassical micro relevant for the areas that you're interested in. And if you're macro, then you study macro areas, neoclassical areas, which are relevant to what you're interested in. Unfortunately, you have to know twice as much or more than any mainstream economist. And And of course, if you're a woman, you have to know 4 times as much, but that's a different discussion. Because usually it's only twice as much, but now you have to know twice as much as a direct economist, and now it escalates to 4. Maybe exponentially, 6 or 10. But the point is that that's what you have to do. You basically have to be twice as good as any neoclassical economist, even to teach in a heterodox program, if you want to do economics appropriately and give the students the best opportunities to know what various viewpoints are out there in a coherent manner. So, with that kind of an introduction, I want to start off with the economy as a whole, as a conceptual and theoretical foundation. Can't talk about what one would talk about in micro unless you actually know what the economy as a whole is. Because the way I deal with the economy as a whole, that is framing the economy, is in a disaggregated framework, not C-I and G. I mean, those are just letters. No relationship to actually any of the items that we're dealing with. And they're not actually referring to any industries or production. So most of the macro you do actually has no production in it whatsoever. And that's 45 to 50% of all economic activity in the American economy. So basically, when you do macro in the traditional way, you actually don't deal with anything important. Just deal with the surplus, as if it magically appeared. And you don't deal with any industries and markets or stuff like that. So we do it in disaggregated framework, which does everything what this very aggregated framework does, but does it better. So framing the economy, this is what I have to go through. You'll notice that I put up a set of schemas and models up here. You're in economics. If you think that you can do anything in economics and not have any recourse to schemas or models, I suggest that you look elsewhere for an occupation. Whether heterodox or mainstream, these things form a way that we engage in analytical reasoning to make points. When you deal with the economy as a whole, this kind of disaggregated framework is the only way to go. You have to provide a schema for it as well as a modeling it. So I'm just going to use that. That's simply a given. Now we can talk about models later and what they should be like, but not at this point. So, productive structure of the economy. First of all, this kind of sets it up. We have a set of what is called basic good structure. Basically, these are the inputs that are needed to produce the surplus of the economy. And that's represented by these G's and L's. These are matrices and different kinds of inputs and labor inputs. And notice how we don't deal with homogeneous labor or heterogeneous inputs, which is what a lot of people do who are heterodox. Let's just simply say that they're stupid and fucking nuts. The reason being is that homogeneous labor is, they say, fine, but we have to have heterogeneous capital. And you come out of Professor Sturgeon's class, 551, and what do you come out with? Veblen's joint stock of knowledge, right? You can't have joint stock of knowledge of differentiated inputs or produced goods without having a differentiated set of labor skills to go along with it. It makes absolutely no sense. These people do it, so it makes no sense. Then they are, in fact, incompetent economists. I don't care who they offend, but the point is, this is what you have to have. There's no getting around that. So if you come out of Professor Sturgeon's class and still want to deal with homogeneous labor, then you should be failing in that class, in this program. You can't do that. Remember, we're dealing with the level of theory, conceptual foundations. And we have a set of resources. This is resources from an institutional perspective, resources become. So they're socially constructed. Not saying that they're not finite, but we socially construct our resources, and through joint stock of knowledge can make either resources appear or not appear. Unfortunately, one of the things I'll mention is that this is an under-theorized area, especially with all those wacko people who like ecology and all this kind of stuff. They should be able to come in and work on this stuff. We don't get enough of it, and the ecologists who are most in our camp don't seem to recognize this. I can put it up there. I can tell you this is an area of research. I can't say much more than that. But what does it do? It means that, well, this are investment goods which are produced in the system. So all of the inputs that produce the intermediate outputs which goes into production of our surplus are all produced, in a sense, socially constructed and reproducible. So the notion of scarcity has no foundation in the system. And that's the issue. Okay, surplus producing goods sector, because what I have here is all the output of the intermediate goods sector, basic goods sector, is utilized in the surplus producing goods sector, and the output of the surplus producing sector is the surplus of the system. So we have the same setup here. So production of the government consumption investment goods in a sense rule the system. What do we call those goods? That's a collective whole. What term would you utilize with them? What? Effective demand. Demand for those goods by the state or the capitalist drives the entire system. And of course, here we have the state. The state also has a set of investment goods and resources, and a set of goods from here going into this, plus a whole set of government people out there, which includes Professor Eaton and myself, because we're paid through the state. And
1/3.
And government payments. They're going to call them transfer payments. Why? Anybody taking 602 and think they're passing?
Government doesn't spend your tax money.
That's right. So it's not transfer money from somebody else. We're the Chartist modern monetary theory framework. They created it. So it's not a transfer payment. Of course, they want to make it a transfer payment to show that somehow you're stealing money from one person and giving it to another. But not in the modern money theory framework, the Chartist. So that's why it's simply government payments. And of course, those go to government services. Although I think it's hard to believe that someone would think Professor Eaton and I do real services, but that's a minor point. And of course, they create, let's see what we have here. They create goods which end up back in their use. What would be such a good? Oh, I know something which dear people, tanks, things like that. Those are investment goods. Would have said lighthouses, but they don't do those anymore. So, okay. And of course, they create these resources. They actually create them. Uranium-235, is that a resource or not? Only when the government decided to produce atom bombs or nuclear power. If you didn't want to do that, that's not a resource. So they created it as a resource. Now, there's a lot of debate about how one would do this. This is a simple institutionalist kind of story. There's got to be a lot more to it. That requires theorizing and thinking. Okay, so what do households do? Households get these goods, and they generate household services activities. Anybody want to go out to dinner with their favorite partner? That would be household services. So these are the kind of things we do. I want to have Stephanie make a whole bunch of cookies for us and bring them to the department. And that would be enough. And of course, investment goods go into the stock of investment goods that are used, and also with resources. Anyway, that's the productive structure of the economy. One thing you notice with this is that this is what really happens. This is how we live our lives. This is the physical relationships. We want to talk about finance. That's something different. It has an impact upon it. But we don't live on finance. We live on production of goods and services. And sometimes that gets lost. But you also will note that these are by sectors or industries, markets, depending on how we disaggregate we want to come, which means that what happens in one industry has an impact throughout the economy. So when you do micro and want to study a particular area, industry, location, whatever, it's not isolated to itself, it's the economy as a whole. In fact, when you get people saying, let's study the financial sector, they do it as if it has, the rest of the stuff is irrelevant. That's certainly not the case, but that's what comes up. Okay. I'm going to have to really speed up when we get through this stuff. The next one. Now, one of the issues is that clearly if I stop with the productive sector, Andreas here would get extraordinarily upset. It means his dissertation proposal topic would be irrelevant. You'd fail him, and that's not what he wants. So clearly there must be a way to think about, in a sense, combining both productive and financial structure of the economy. Now, a lot of stuff one can deal with, but first of all, I'll simply state straightforwardly, first of all, the classes, capitalist class, the state, and those who have to work for a living, so to speak, working class, and their dependents. So it's a class system. And in this class system, certain classes have more say than others, such as the capitalist class, which can determine production of investment and consumption goods, and of course the state, which is in conjunction with the capitalist class, determines state demand for goods. And they can finance that with state money and so So those so those are there. We want to start an economy in which there's no state. I've done that many, many times until Professor Kelton and Professor Ray wrapped me around the head a few times. Even though I had read Keynes' monetary treatise on money book, first book, which I've always agreed there's always state-created money, never filtered into my work until I got slapped around a bit. And it's, so you ever start modeling, talking about something without the state, like a lot of this, these weird people in the monetary circuit approach and things like that, you just have banks and no state. I don't know what world they're in, but you're not in the world that we exist in. So if you want to do that, fine, go write fairy tales, they're much more interesting. So you have to start with the state, you have to start with classes and state money, bottom line. Okay, of course once you have government expenditures, the state money, what do you end up with? Financial assets. As long as we don't have a balanced budget, we're going to create financial assets in the system. Now, I like to just say the state just gets control of financial assets. That would make a lot of other people upset. So we'll have a financial banking sector. But it's all predicated on, as Professor Kelton has written, on the fact that the state creates these financial assets through debt. So, this means, in this particular case, we have to have it in the banking sector, which uses a set of inputs, just like before, and they produce what? They produce loans, right? And those are what? A set of financial assets for various sectors, such as either loans for the basic goods sector and the household enterprise sector. So it creates loans for those sectors, which are deposited back to them as financial assets, right? So that's about as far as I can go on all this stuff. That's why people like Matthew O'Brien or others out there trying to make this a bit more elaborate. But that's the basic blocks is that through state expenditures, we have a set of financial assets and liabilities throughout the system, which is what these are. So what we have now is a statement of the economy in which there's both a productive structure and a financial structure integrated to each other. And most importantly, we have a framework, a disaggregated framework, which is totally consistent integrated with modern monetary theory and charters. One of the punchlines I'm going to talk about, and I've already mentioned it, that if you have a micro and a macro being taught at this institution, which didn't have this integration, then as a student, I would revolt. Much more so now than you're dealing with the dean. We're talking about how you think. That's much more important than whether there's any money in the department or not. So beware of this in the future when replacements for 602 and myself become an issue. You want an integrated framework. You don't want to be going into one class that says one thing, another micro class that says another. I'm paid for a political announcement. Okay. So, where does this bring us? In this framework, where are, in a sense, profits going to come from? You've got to come from someplace, right? They're going to have to come from a surplus, right? Profits are going to be somehow attached to the surplus because all the intermediate stuff is just cost. So you have to have a connection of profits through some form of surplus, wages to some form of surplus. You already know where government gets for it. That's government expenditures. They already have it. And that filters into the system as profits. If you've been able to figure out what Professor Ray, you're talking about. You want to bring it to cluster. So what this brings us up to is the last another picture. Oops. Okay. Now, this gets really elaborate, but let's don't dwell on it too much. I've implied about financial structure of the system. How about the kernel financial balances? You have government expenditures minus taxes, but total profits after taxes. And what does that consist of? It consists of investment goods and the liabilities and assets of the system. Right? That's what total profits. So profits are connected to two things: investment goods and government expenditures. That's how you create profits. You don't create profits by exploiting labor. Create profits by investment in government expenditures. Now that requires people to work beyond what they need to reproduce themselves. But it's not the same thing precisely as exploitation of labor. Because even if you had a totally cooperative system, you would still be producing investment goods, which means that they have to be set up for consumption goods produced for you, but you're not producing them, so to speak. So some people are producing more consumption goods which they need than they need or get to be able to support others. That's what we would call exploitation in Marx. Within the government expenditures, that's the same thing. And people producing goods for others. That is beyond their needs. So, we have a different way of talking about the origin of profits, but clearly profits are produced. There's no shortage of profits in the system. Either you produce more investment goods, or you get the government to run up a bigger deficit. Anytime you want to reduce that deficit, you're simply reducing the profits in the system. This is modern monetary theory chartless approach to this. So, those are profits. So we have an explanation about profits. Does not involve the labor theory of value. But although it has resemblance to aspects of what they're trying to get at in terms of labor theory of value. Doesn't mean that Marx is wrong, it means that we've gone beyond it. If you can't go beyond an economist and economist, then I suggest that you have an occupation in which the final word was written 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 500 years, or 50 years ago. There's no final words in economics. If you don't hear the science, and there's no final words said by any one economist. And if you're not good enough to go beyond that, then you're not a very good economist. Now, although I didn't say here, where do wages come from? Production of consumption goods. can't have wages before the production of consumption goods, because you produce consumption goods for people to buy wages. So production of consumption goods creates wages. So, if you have this kind of system, then we'll have an issue about distribution in a particular way. We'll get back to that. But the point is that it's still disaggregated. I have taxes in here. Nobody. This is making things complex. What do taxes do?
Reflux.
What?
Reflux, they bring money back.
That is, they reduce the amount of financial assets people have in the system. That's all they do. That's why Professor Ray said, get rid of Social Security tax. It's an issue about legitimation. Now, we could get rid of Social Security tax, and in fact, there's no Social Security tax in the UK. Well, they do have some contribution pension, but they pay the pensions right out of the government expenditures. So they could reduce it to nothing and still do it, unlike what they talk about here. But it's an issue of legitimation. In this current system, we need all legitimation for government expenditures on people of the lower 99%. I would say 90%, who cares about the top 10%? They're making all like bandits in any case. Okay. What's that? Okay. Agency. Just briefly talk about this. We have five major forms of agency in the system. We have 5 forms of agency in the system, all predicated on the acting person. Too bad Alex has left, because this comes right out of social economics. If you think you are a heterodox economist of any sort, don't know this stuff out of social economics, think again. Not very many people want to review social economics or go into anything like that. They know why? Well, when it really talks about people or agency as real things, unlike what passes. Well, Marxists do a lot better job than hell post-Keynesians. There's actually almost no agency in their work. So we have 5 major acting organizations, institutions: business, state, household, market governments, and class-based organizations such as trade unions. And they make a whole bunch of decisions about the surplus, bank loans, employment, prices, wages, salaries, markups, dividends, discrete government payments, and taxes. So, anytime you want to talk about what are taxes in the system, you have to have an agent. And this agent is not the entire system. So to speak, you have to talk about the state as a form of agency. And what in the hell did post-Keynesians talk about when they get to the state? Nothing. Except the state must be nice. You have no clue. And it's deliberate, because when you start saying the state is part of a class conflict, then you can't say, let's go to the state. You have to transform the state. They don't talk about that. And they don't talk about the state in conjunction with the business community. Post-Keynesians are simply ideologically in favor of the status quo. Otherwise, they would talk about the state. I've been having this argument with post-Keynesians for decades. They make presumptions about what the state is, and they also at the same time talk about how bad workers are because they want higher wages. And they pass it off as post-Keynesian theory, qua policy. And I object to it. And they say, okay, but never changes. Post-Keynesians believe in the status quo, unless you come up to a few wackos like myself. It still occurs today. The LR is not designed to change the system. Never has been. Designed to maintain the status quo in the system, prevent it from changing through social uprising. Not that the state can't carry out the LR anytime they want to through their monetary policy. I mean, they can do it. But it's not designed to change the system. Okay. And these are the core decisions made in the economy. Okay. Now, from this, from this, we'll talk about modeling the economy as a whole. Basically what I've done is simply added acting organizations to the rest of the structure. And so far I've only had structures. You can structure the economy easily, but that doesn't tell you what the economy does. You have to have agency. Unfortunately, Marx says post-Keynesian, because these are the ones who do the primary modeling stuff in heterodox economics, which is fine. I don't have any problem with that. But they don't have much about agency. They'll set up a model and simply have it run. They actually don't talk about people making decisions. Because what happens when you have people make decisions? What?
Your parameters change.
Your parameters change, so there's no equilibrium. The system changes when people make decisions. Now they don't want that. They want to stay in some kind of equilibrium framework so they can change parameters and not talk about agency. I did that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Remember, I slopped around a bit here and had to think about stuff. And agency actually really is important because I keep talking about it. Enterprises do this, that, and the other. Let's make it systematic and framework. Let's be consistent. So I'm not calling the kettle black because I did this stuff in the past. The problem is they do it now. And you may get people even coming out here who do it. They simply change parameters and they're talking about how a system works with no agency whatsoever. So even modeling the economy as a whole, or in a disaggregated way, you cannot talk about it as if there's no agency. The only way things do happen is when agents make decisions that they happen. And parameters get changed. So there's no equilibrium, no long-run scenarios that are definite in their end position. There's cumulative causation, but without an end. That's perfectly fine. We have to do things more historically, as opposed to simply changing the parameters of a model. Of course, at your stage, this is what you want to do. You want to see how models work. I'm not talking about you at this stage. I'm talking about you when you're a settled economist out there and trying to do some really serious stuff that you would start modeling in an equilibrium fashion versus not. So you got to do all this, that's silly stuff, interesting stuff about changing parameters and see how these things work out. You want to be able to think how things work in some abstract analytical way. For example, I can say, well, in this framework, if we want to change wage rates, what would be kind of impact that we could be looking for? So you explore it. But if you want to say how the actual world worked, you can't say that the parameters remain unchanged as you change things to agency. Of course, the other one important here is that I have a trade union where it doesn't exist in almost anything as an important agent in the system, except for some Marxists. If you don't know what comes out of radical political economy, Marxism, that comes out of Conference of Social Economists, and I'm trying to, the Union of Radical Political Economy. You don't know what's coming out of that, then you don't know what are important things that's happening in heterodox economics. And there's other ones you should be exploring as well. Okay. The last one, the one that Drew's going to like. That was our economy. This economy gets placed into a social fabric matrix developed by Great Hagen and others, in which we have norms and institutions, joint stock of knowledge, ecological system, have an influence on how, these are the agents of the system, influencing the agents of the system to make decisions. These are all, in a sense, agency. So when the agents influence the agents so they make decisions about the social provisioning process, that's production of the surplus. So that's what it's placed in. So you don't think of the economy independent of itself, it's within a socially embedded framework. If you don't know what that socially embedded framework is, then you have an incomplete picture about what things are going on. So Greg Hagen's work, who's the pioneer of this, is very important. Not meaning that you will spend a lot of time with the social fabric matrix, but it will give you a way to help ground your framework, whether it's a very narrow one, looking at banking or a city or something. But the point is that the economic activities that go on are not generated simply inside those economic activities. They come from a much broader framework, basically socially embedded economy. But since that's a truism, because how could there not be one, unless you believe in Carter or neoclassical economists? It's always been socially embedded. It's just that we have a set of ideas out there which says the economy is not socially embedded. You know, the trouble is people believe these very silly ideas. Might as well go believe in hobbits, which are actually much more interesting to believe in than a non-socially embedded economy. Okay. And the last part is that we're in a historical context, a particular way in which we do things. So you're always in history. History, the social fabric of the economy, is embedded in the economy itself, which means that every economic analysis is an historical one. If you believe you can do economic analysis outside of history, then every variable that we use has no meaning. Because every variable that we have in economics is historically grounded, historically contextualized. You take them out of history, you take them out of historical time, and they have no meaning. Another way of saying is that equilibrium framework is not what you would want to look at. You want to look at some kind of more developed, articulated, historical, theoretic framework. I've only talked about it, I've only worked on it briefly. I have a lot more work to do. Okay. The last thing which I want to really have time is that this framework of the economy as a whole, there's also an output employment model in it and a price model. Maybe I'll come back to those. Those are where the agencies make decisions about what to produce and who gets employed, and the price model, which is designed to explain how prices get set and generating income for enterprises. Can't talk about that because I only got about 5 more minutes before I have to switch on to another topic. But we'll hopefully we'll get through most of it. Okay. This is the next topic: effective demand, income distribution, and the social provisioning process. Again, this is the level of the economy as a whole. It still looks like macro, and the way people think about micro and macro. To me, this all looks like micro, but I have a bizarre view of the world. You should not have my bizarre view of the world. You just simply should see it as the economy as a whole. Now, so what does effective demand do? Well, effective demand is the production of the surplus. So when you talk about effective demand, you're talking about producing the surplus of the system. Is there any constraints to production of that surplus? Remember, we had all the inputs, either reproducible or socially constructed inputs. In that context, there is no given inputs which are relatively scarce, just given to the system. So there is no productive constraint to the system. The system can produce whatever it wants to produce, that is, in case of production. Clearly, if there's a shortage of a particular kind of labor power, what does the system do? Well, change the technology to use different kinds of labor power, or set up an educational system which produces that kind of training. That's what we do. So there's no constraint of labor. Never has been, not to mention that anybody outside the borders of the United States are capable of working and learning. So they always come here and learn and do whatever. There's no shortage. So labor, notice now full employment as a constraint to the system is a bogus notion. Always has been. Now you want to try to employ as many people as possible, but there's no notion of full employment, unless you want to believe that there's a notion of full employment. You keep changing. So that's not a constraint to the system. There may be shortages while you work through it, but that's not a fundamental constraint, because what a fundamental constraint of the system is supposed to do? If you have relative scarcity, so that there's a constraint of what can be produced, what does that generate in neoclassical economics? What?
Prices.
Well, exchange and prices. That's what it does. So that's why they had no constraint in the system, there'd be no prices, right? Everything would be free. So that's what constraints do. If you want to put in a constraint into the system, then what you're saying that the system is organized through a price mechanism. If you say that, then throw out effective demand and stop coming to this class. Go to neoclassical, that's what it does. So the system is not constrained in that way. There may be shortages. You may say something which are resources are no longer resources. Get rid of whaling, for example. Make your damn perfume out of some chemicals. I would use well water for it, which is what they did. We actually stopped whaling for whales that would produce stuff to make candles, because we got candles otherwise. The point is you can tell some resources should be resources, you can create others. We have shortages, you may say, well, we want to put a whole bunch of wind farms out there in Kansas and eliminate coal production. Which is hard for me as a person who likes labor history. I want to get rid of coal production. So you can do that. Now, people here have a hard time with all these wind farms. It's just they grow up and go to Europe where they have wind farms everywhere. It's not all that bad. The point is, this is what we do. These are socially constructed decisions, deal with issues of shortages. So you can, as an ecological economist, would argue, accept that the system has no productive constraints. And then simply argue how we carry out production, which resources we want to use or not. But it's not an inherent constraint in rules the system through a price mechanism, which is what many people don't get. Okay, this first one. Is there a savings profit constraint in the system? Well, if you have a saving constraint in the system of profit, then again you're organizing the system through a price mechanism. Here, remember, since things are producible and reproducible, there's no constraint on production of investment goods. And in fact, it's the production of investment goods which creates profits, that is, savings, to buy them. So there's no saving constraint in the system. People talk about in heterodox, they're really neoclassical economists. Because they're talking about it through a price mechanism. Because what is savings regulated through? Interest rates. That's a price. So if you're going to say that investment is regulated through an interest rate, you're talking about investment being regulated through a price mechanism. So you have to be very clear. Again, the only thing you're dealing with is a constraint in the system which generates in some fashion a set of prices to regulate the system. You have to be very careful. If you want to be really radical, you attack the price mechanism. That's what radical stuff does. That's the core. Okay. The government expenditures are somehow constraining savings and profits and investment. The answer is obviously, if you're going to pass the qualifying exam, the answer is no. So there is no constraint in terms of government expenditure. In fact, government expenditures help generate surplus and profits in the system through the deficit spending. The wage rates and wages, production and consumption, could somehow have a negative impact on profits. Well, how many people think that distribution of income is a constraint to the system? If we had a more equal distribution of income, we'd have a better economic system. Well, first of all, can the economy produce as much in consumption goods as it wants? Remember, we're unconstrained in terms of production. So it could, right? It also produces as much investment goods as it wants. So it would appear that the production of consumption goods is not a constraint on investment goods. If you think that, then you're in a production possibilities frontier, neoclassical economics with constraints. That's what you're in. Fine. If you want to do that, go to KU. Don't do it here. The system is not constrained in that way. So producing more consumption goods versus investment goods or government goods are non-constrainable. The model that I had up there about production, basic goods in the surplus sector, is a way to articulate it. So there's no constraint on this stuff. So increasing consumption goods, in this case, we have to increase wages or wage rates to purchase them, right? Remember, wages equals consumption. Wage goods equals value consumption. We do that. Doesn't have any impact on profit squeeze. Bunch of kind of claptrap, which is very bad in analysis, which again would argue that they think in terms of a price mechanism and production possibilities from there. There's also a bunch of other problems, but that's another issue. Theoretically, that's what they seem to do. They never claim that too much profits has a negative impact upon the system. They never say that in this kind of argument. Okay, what the prices are doing, prices are a way that the going concerns generate their income flows to remain going concerns. It's a different proposition at all from coordinating economic activity. We won't go into that. Income distribution. Clearly, income distribution is not between households and business enterprises. Business enterprises get their profits from investment goods and getting basically profits from the government in an indirect way, which they then have as financial assets, where they distribute to households. So the notion between enterprises making so much profit and workers making so much wages, whatever, that's an irrelevant scenario. Distribution of income is a question inside the households and who gets what. Now, when you start separating households into two kind of categories, households which have access to dividends, for example, because they're either part of the management class or they have access to it, they can inherit it from their grandmothers, who got a whole bunch of financial assets and generate a lifestyle that would not normally be accompanied with an ordinary professor, things like this. So if you have access to those, then your income will be great, whether you get paid more or not. If you work at much lower paying jobs, and what do we have here? We have a set of consumption goods which are designed for certain kinds of people. Remember, you're going to spend your income on particular kinds of consumption goods. If you produce very cheap consumption goods, who are that going to go to? Certainly not those of us who like to go to Pierpont or Union Station for dinner. They'll be going for those who can't afford it. So the production of cheap consumption goods are for those which are designed for those with low income. So the issue of income distribution is the kind of consumption goods you produce. The construction or the development of Walmart and their cheap goods made by blood labor and elsewhere was simply designed or had the impact of lowering workers' wages. Workers aren't designed to save anything, they're designed to spend their entire income. And that's how we model it. So the distribution of income may be a problem, but it's not the income distribution that we have. It's the production of a whole set of cheap goods and services for particular classes. You don't see these same goods being produced for the wealthy. You have a different set of goods. So the issue of production, the enterprises, along with the conjunction with the state, demanding certain kind of goods to be produced, and then constructing a set of wages to buy them. And that's the issue. That's a social issue. It's a social issue. It's not income distribution. That just simply falls out of it. So when you complain about income distribution, you're complaining about the wrong thing. You're complaining about a set of production, consumption goods for certain classes. Basically, why should, quote, the poor live in crap housing? We have a system which can produce excellent housing for them, but we don't. That's the issue. The wages simply fall out of that. So I'm never a big fan of all this demand about income distribution, because I see that as a much more fundamental problem. It exhibits itself as an income distribution problem, but that's a secondary, that's an ephemeral kind, or not that's wrong, a secondary kind of outcome of it, not really getting nothing to do with the problem. Because if you then question about what enterprises want to produce, or the government producing less for various segments of our society, then you're fundamentally questioning the nature of this capitalist system. That's clearly what people don't want to have happen. Okay. 20 minutes, and we have, Julie says that we can just keep that other class out in the hallway until 2:30. So there'll be some questions. So, microeconomic, what is it meant by it in the context of the economy as a whole? I've already kind of mentioned this. Micro versus macro, eliminate the phrase. I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it. I only use it as joking to get people to think about this traditional way of thinking about stuff. I know it comes very odd from a person like myself, who's a micro person, because I'm actually objecting to how people call me, and how, in one sense, I would identify myself. I hope the future is different from what I lived through in the past. We have a interdependent, disaggregated economy in which agency-specific issues, where agency, you can examine specific issues such as households, or what a trade union is. You can examine those as specific issues. And that's what would be sort of thought as micro. That's traditional. So agents in the system are particular areas to study. And this becomes interesting in many kinds of ways. But it doesn't mean that you're not doing micro and macro at the same time. It's just that traditionally people have treated this as a micro kind of issue. I just see it as an issue of agency within a wholly independent economy. So you have agency-specific issues and stuff. Of course, you can have market, industry, sector, geographical, location-specific issues. So urban economics, they kind of just cast it out there as something different. It's as relevant if you study the computer industry. It's simply a different way of looking at a particular sector and which can be examined in the economy as a whole. So they're connected. In particular, well, we can go further. So we have agency or market, whatever, specific analysis. How each specific analysis is interdependent with each other specific analysis. So when you talk about urban, you cannot help but also talk about markets in your urban area, and then agent decisions by enterprises to either produce or not produce there, or state decisions. So there's no possible way of studying any one specific analysis and have it be isolated from anything else. And that means you're back in the economy as a whole, more or less. The reason that people think they can do this is that if you're in a partial equilibrium framework, the only way to make it run is if it's isolated. Clearly what I've rejected outright is any form of partial equilibrium. It's the economy as a whole. We look at interdependent parts of it. And this is not an attack on neoclassical economics, but attack on many heterodox economists who think in these terms. And finally, which I've already mentioned, is that the specific analysis must be completely consistent, coherent, and integrated with modern monetary theory. Can't do it without it. That will upset a lot of people. Okay, microeconomic topics, dissertation, future research, etc., which may interest you. First of all, this is from a theorist. I know people think I might be an applied or empirical economist, simply because I think that the only way to do theory is to actually know something about the economy, and that requires not only good qualitative research, interviews, whatever, archival studies. It also means a whole range of statistical analysis. If you think that you can get out and become a good economist without some basic good knowledge of econometrics, or social network analysis, or a range of other forms of statistical analysis, computational theory, etc., agent-based complexity theory, whatever, then you're wrong. I was a graduate student. I took a course in econometrics. I don't believe that there's random distribution of variables, which underline your conventional econometrics. So I didn't take the second semester. I'm in history and everything is culture related. Worst mistake of my life. I would have to learn a whole bunch of Bayesian stuff. That's what the second semester was kind of making for the been back in the late 70s, early 80s. Not that that would be particularly useful. But I never took the time to really learn the econometrics. And that has been a drag on my work my entire career. So if you think that you can become a decent economist without thoroughly knowing 525, then you are wrong. Bottom line, you are wrong.
He's coming tonight.
The way I do econometrics now is get friends to help. Firstly, knows this because I come up and ask them about different ways of doing rank and whatever kinds of correlation, because I didn't take the time to learn this stuff. So I choose friends to help me. You don't want to be as bad as me. You don't have to be as good as Professor E. You don't want to be as bad as me. You want to be able to know how to ask the right kind of questions when you come to econometric or statistical analysis, so you can figure out what you need to do and who to help you with it. But don't do the damn thing that I did as a graduate student. I still believe we're in a totally causally created world. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't have learned my econometrics. Okay. So this is topics in terms of theory. If you're going to do a research dissertation, you're going to do a dissertation, future research. My position is that the only sensible research to do is one that helps develop heterodox economic theory. So there has to be something in that research that drives at developing heterodox economic theory in some fashion. So you don't want to say, simply do a study which is self-contained without having an impact upon how that economic theory would be developed. It means that people like myself, who would read, say, more of applied work, do so because they want to know what you're actually working on. But it would be helpful that this applied work is designed to develop a particular theoretical point. So that particular theoretical point happens to be in cartels or happens to be in prices or whatever. It means I would be interested in having to deal with future derivatives in the markets. I might not be interested in, but other people would be interested in. Because people will really work outside their area if that work has an impact on the theoretical developments relevant to their area. So you want to make that kind of connection. I would also argue, because I'm a theorist, that the research must, remember, we're dealing from microeconomics, or kind of traditional way of looking, must engage with the price mechanism and refute it. If you don't have anything to say about the price mechanism and the way of how economic activity is organized from a neoclassical perspective, I know people don't want to deal at all with neoclassical economics or whatever. You don't have a luxury. You are truly the 1% in the other direction. The only way to change it is to actually forcefully engage, even though you may not read it, forcefully engage with price mechanism. People want to say, well, the capital controversy, that's where all that's where the real confrontation comes to play. Well, how do we know that didn't work? But what do capital controversies do, fundamentally? Question the price mechanism. But there's been a long development of question the price mechanism called the energy price controversy, or Marxist controversy. It's all challenges the price mechanism. But this is a much more direct challenge. That the price mechanism doesn't exist, doesn't work. That's why people like Garignani can keep their job, Gardner Means can't. People who directly challenge the price mechanism at this fundamental level have a much more difficult time being in the same profession. But that's what you must do. Because until you challenge that price mechanism, which would mean ultimately that markets don't work or don't work, that's actually the wrong phrase. Markets are socially constructed. There's no notion of them working or not. People work, not markets. When you reject that is rejecting the price mechanism, then you're saying every argument that any neoliberal has ever put out has no coherent theoretical foundation. on their own terms, perhaps. And that's what you have to do. If you don't question that, then you might as well just not do anything. Because you're not questioning what is the fundamental theoretical underpinnings of mainstream economics. That's what you have to question. You do it many different kinds of ways, but it has to come back there if you want to make an impact and change the system of how we do economics. Okay. I would argue that all dissertations must do both, but that's certainly up to the individual and their dissertation advisor. My dissertation on full cost pricing implied both development of heterodox theory as also the rejection of price mechanism. It wasn't as articulated back then. I had 400 pages to do it in. I didn't make it that clear. It was there, but it took me a while to really fully develop that. An example of a problem in which there is no attack on the price mechanism. Modern monetary theory deals with ELR. We all know this. And we know that they've made statements about inflation. That somehow when you run an ELR, you run the economy up to full employment, there'll be inflation. So the question is, why do we give a damn? Remember, how do I talk about the economy being coordinated? Through effective demand, right? Not through prices. Prices don't do that. Prices have another job to do. So from this perspective, inflation is irrelevant. So why do they talk about it? It's because Tom Pally keeps attacking them, that they don't have any explanation for inflation. And they give in to this and try to come up with something. Our response is Tom Pally's neoclassical economy. Because he believes that somehow inflation, if it has any meaning, isn't something that works through a price mechanism that directs, in effect, how economic activity gets coordinated. Now, if you don't believe that's the case, then who gives a damn about inflation? This is a theoretical issue. We're not talking about the politics of this stuff. We're talking about the theoretical issue of whether rising prices, because we run into a constraint in the system, affects how the system works. That's what we're asking. It's a theoretical issue. People get tied up in all the politics. It's a theoretical issue. If the system is not constrained in that way, then there's no notion of running up to the full utilization of resources. And hence, there is no inflation in that particular way. I can give you inflation anytime you want it. It's called increasing production coefficients in the production models. That gives rising prices. Everything else remains constant. Oh, gee whiz. I can talk about inflation. Nobody talks about inflation that way, unless, of course, it's the damn labor which is doing it. But the point is that we can have rising prices in a heterodox world due to declining productivity of your inputs, which means rising production coefficients. You can blame it all on the damn ecologists and things like that. But the point is, you can do that. That's no problem. But when people don't talk about that, inflation in that particular way. Sometimes it moves some reference, but not really. So, when inflation is talked about as an issue for ELR, then they bought into the price mechanism, and you're basically talking neoclassical economics. A constraint-based system in which the prices emerge and organize the economy. They should stop talking about it altogether and simply tell Pally and everybody else they're a bunch of neoclassical economists. And that's not going to happen. They're not me. Okay. The other areas of interest of talk about, I'm just going to go through briefly. Business enterprise. You can do stuff on prices. Between Wingu and myself, that's not a most fruitful area to look at. But how do enterprise undertake investment? You can do some econometric stuff, like Steve Frazzari down at WashU. But nobody really does it from how actual enterprises do it, from a heterodox perspective. You don't get research like that. Or actually very little. That would be one thing. How wage rates are determined? Where's Christian Dodge? Christian Dodge asked a very interesting question when Fred Mosley was here. If the way that they set wages in this melt stuff, the way to get labor through value, but that's not how it actually gets set in the economy, then why do we care? The question is, some people defended it. which means that empirical evidence about how the actual world works is irrelevant. There's enough work in this. Hell, I sent out a list of journals which people could buy. The one journal that wasn't bought dealt with labor, which means that heterodox economists in general don't give a damn about labor, wage rates, or anything along this line, whether generally or at the level of the enterprise. If you don't give a damn about labor, then you might as well do something else with your life. Not my area, but as a collective whole, there should be an environment people will be interested in. Unfortunately, I wish it would happen in this program. We don't know anything about how profit markups are set. That requires too much work. You have to go in next to ask individual enterprises, how do they do this stuff? Do a lot of work. But we don't. People make all kinds of generalized statements. I can give you some kind of structural understanding of them. But how they actually do it at the level of enterprise, I've read an awful lot of stuff giving me some indication, but we don't really know. Easy to do easy work. Much more difficult to do hard work. Unfortunately, the real advances come with the hard work. Okay, I've already mentioned the state. Work needs to be done on that. Household, with all kinds of work to be done on that. We get very little work about household for all kinds of reasons. Feminist economists do work, and some Marxists, even social economists. Do we get anybody from a post-Keynesian kind of background doing this? The answer is no. In fact, when there was some effort, we have something on gender for the JPKE, Paul Davidson turned it down. If you want to think that post-Keynesians are really open to this stuff, think again. That's why I say I'm a heterodox economist. I come from a post-Keynesian background. People have actually denied that I'd actually do this. That can be identified as post-Keynesian. That's basically lying. But it doesn't mean it's an all-encompassing one. I stopped calling myself a post-Keynesian back in the 90s when I realized that I've been constantly drawn from institutionalist, Marxist, social, and now obviously social economics approach. What I do is not post-Keynesian, although it's clearly defined components can be seen as post-Keynesian. If I start out with a system which has class, I'm not a post-Keynesian. Those Keynesians do not talk about class. I come from, so I'm engaging with other traditions, so I'm putting them together. As heterodox economists. Shouldn't be ashamed that you come from some kind of post-Keynesian background. But it's not the end all and be all of anything. If you think that it is, then you've severely limited yourself to being a good economist. Okay. Market governance, you're just going to talk to Christian about market governance, how markets work, and how they get constructed and organized. The neoclassical economists have gone to incredible lengths to talk about cartels in the last 15 or 20 years. Almost no heterodox. I've done stuff we've never had it published, which on the surface indicates no heterodox stuff. How could that possibly be the case that no heterodox economist is interested in how actual markets work? I got to go read a whole bunch of damn neoclassicals to get stories about how the markets work. And they infuse it with neoclassical theory to no end, as if it's truth. If you're not going to engage in how actual markets work, as opposed to some financial set of markets, which are only one small form of markets in the entire economy, and they don't do it through cartels, because I've actually asked, and they said, no, there's no cartels out there, collective agreements to how financial markets work, etc. Nonsense. I got this from Gary Dembski. Nonsense. He didn't understand how the system worked and can't interpret the data. If you don't do this stuff, then you might as well just pack it up, because you're not actually talking about the economy any of us live in. Where cartels determine prices for pharmaceuticals in third world countries, not to mention our country. They run it through a cartel. Or various kinds of chemicals for agricultural production. My God, these are the things that we live off of. And nobody gives a damn about how these markets work. So that's another area. And of course, except for the Marxists out there, nobody gives a damn about trade unions or worker organizations. The closest we get to it here is cooperatives. Most of us don't live in cooperatives. There's room to do both, law, but people don't seem to want to do that. An interesting thing is that when we talk about industry and sectors of the economy, we can do all kinds of work in this. But you know, the financial sector is simply a sector of the economy, it's not the economy. The state is simply one sector of the economy, it's not the economy. And of course, there's a whole bunch of industrial retail sectors. If you somehow think that you're talking about the economy as a whole and just talk about the financial sector, then you're wrong. But we clearly need to work in all three, all these various sectors. And there's not that kind of work being done. And so if you start getting down to specific areas or whatever, I've already mentioned this, urban, regional, city, these are particular kind of sectorial areas of the economy which need a lot of work being done on it. Resources become is another one. Personally, I think if you had to actually choose something, that would be one, because it would be a way to integrate all the ecological movement people into a heterodox framework in a consistent manner. This is far beyond dissertation. It's an agenda for a decade, but a dissertation could be a beginning point, just like my full cost pricing dissertation can be a beginning point, producing a heterodox microeconomic theory text, which is still coming after 30 years, but don't let that discourage you. We have a lot of gender and race stuff done by everybody outside of post-Keynesian economics, which means if you want to integrate insights from all of those, then you should do so. There have been a couple of works by Darshili, but not nearly enough to deal with it. Development, international trade. If these are somehow different areas, I don't understand how development can be thought of as something that is separate from what we talk about in the United States. So you talk about development in the third world, why not use the same kind of approaches to talk about the United States? I just don't see a distinction. We're talking about different kinds of countries where there are different kinds of economies and how they work. In international trade, it's simply the difference between whether you import your inputs from Mexico, or you create them here in the United States. So you import them from another industry in the United States. What's the difference? It's simply a legal system that you have to go through. So I don't see any difference between international trade, in one sense, and how we talk about inter-industry flows in the United States. I would say a lot more integrated than those two. Basically, international trade means that you don't have to deal, you can isolate things, and I'm not interested in isolations. Okay, let's just jump to what is not so good research or dissertation very quickly. One that does not engage with core heterodox theory, one does not engage with the price mechanism. History of economic thought in isolation is not good. It should be history of economic thought tied with the development of heterodox theory and an attack on the price mechanism, like my full cost pricing. So one can do history of economic thought, but you have to be very careful. My dissertation was a form of history of economic thought, although it started in the 1930s with people who think it's history of thought. Certainly not back when I did it. But it was history of thought, but designed to engage with a contemporary issue of how prices are set, which is a very controversial, and on one hand, and of course help develop heterodox theory. Future, well, I'm going to skip that. Do you have any questions? Yes?
I have a couple questions.
I only get to ask one,
Only one?
because we have others, and I only have 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll just ask this first one then. So you talked a lot about how macro is conceived from a heterodox perspective, as it's conventionally conceived, so C plus I plus G, right? I was thinking about that. Do you think that the reason why they conceive it that way is because you could talk about the circular flow, and and that there's because the MPC is always less than 1, there's a demand gap, and then you can bring in Keynes and all of that. And the corollary to that is, there's one thing if you're just thinking about the circular flow in one way, but then as you model the economy as a disaggregated economy, in that you can actually immediately talk about production, how the actual production process works. And if you're just thinking about it conceptually as a circular flow, you're not necessarily thinking how the production, all the production parts work together. You're just thinking about kind of like even necessarily the flows of income that are attached to it.
So you're dealing with the second part. Income flows attached to surplus.
Yeah.
Well, you want to call that circular flow. I don't call it circular flow. It has nothing to do with the circular flow necessary to go, the circuit of production that goes from one circuit to the next.
No,
That's the circular
I mean
flow.
from like the conventional macro.
Well, that's what it is, conventional macro. It means it's neoclassical. So, what is conventional macro? Remember when these people come back from conception of the economy in which production, even in Keynes, he does have some production, but the way he dealt with it is very minimal. He had different objectives. I'm not going to, but we're talking about people 20 and 30 years later who still use this. And it's deliberate. Why neoclassical economists want to eliminate production from macro? First of all, it has to ask different kinds of questions. You can have a real Marxian interpretation put in there or whatever. Well, I think it's laziness. Supposedly Keynes did this makes it right. No, Keynes did something. Who the hell cares about just because he did it right? If you believe that, then stop being an economist and go to some place where you have beliefs. I don't care what Keynes said. I only care what he said what seems to be reasonable. And I'll discard the rest, just like I do Paul Davidson or anybody else I study under. I'm not interested in people, I'm interested in ideas. So, they may keep it for that reason. It means that they, in fact, are very undereducated. Because you had Leontief, 30s and 40s and 50s, which all this stuff is completely consistent with. And the stuff where I said, if you have a circular production system, that there's no constraints, so you can increase investment goods without having any impact on the economy. Hell, that was shown in terms of even mathematicians talking about it in the 1950s. Where do you think I get the stuff from? So there's no constraint in Leontief, but it cleared the economy as a whole. So we have a whole bunch of macroeconomists who learn the macroeconomics and don't even learn anything about Leontief. This is deliberate. They've made a deliberate choice not to know about the economy as a result. They could have. We're not saying that they had to invent this stuff. It was there. They deliberately decided not to do that. So I can't answer your full question. I can simply say that what has come up is an undereducated approach to how to do macro. And it was always there in the first place. Another question. Yes, Alex.
So neoclassical economics adopts the idea of consumer sovereignty over what will be produced, and you're saying that distribution falls out of production, particularly the consumer goods and how it's produced. So are you saying that the distribution of income has no impact on what is produced, or is there?
No. What is produced determines the distribution of income.
Right. Does the distribution of income have an impact on what is produced? I think you could
I
make
think
the
that's an
argument
open question.
that it determines somewhat effective
No,
demand.
no, it may. If you say it does, you go out and prove it. I can certainly say that the production decision about what is produced is determined in the business enterprise. They take a whole bunch of things into account. But what you want to say is the agency of households affect those decisions. You prove it. That's the one. I give you one way which I think there's evidence to be warrantably assertable. Doesn't make it entirely right. But what I am doing is saying that agency and households are much more constrained, much more limited in their impact. And things are being controlled elsewhere. So I come from a class system analysis, etc., which best decision making in a particular class, and the residual stuff in others. You prove it. instead of asserting it. Asserting it is a neoclassical notion. You prove it from a heterodox perspective because we don't actually know the answer. If you want answers to everything before you come here, then you come to the wrong place. We don't have answers. We have ways to go about arriving at those answers. Another question, yes, Abby?
Where do you see a structural change within your model of the economy as a whole coming from?
Enterprises,
Enterprises?
or the state.
In
We have the internet because of the state. Not to mention mass production. State and enterprise, yeah.
In terms of the cultural values, norms, and institutions, though within this social fabric matrix, while they're delivering ideology to the acting organizations, they themselves seem to just arise. There's nothing that is...
I've been in a historical context. It has to be the history, so it's just don't arise. They're historically contingent. That just gives you a framework to work in. Doesn't give you answers. But the point is, what's the conventional framework, even from a heterodox perspective? The economy. Structural change comes from without. And I'm here putting in, it doesn't come from without, it comes from a set of norms, etc. Why do pharmaceutical companies believe that they can do all the construction of new goods in pharmacy? Why shouldn't the state control that? Well, that's social fabric matrix start telling the answers to that. So it just doesn't spring up internally in the economy. That just gives you a starting point. That's the whole point. Because prior to that, we don't have that starting point unless you're a Marxist. And that's the most wonderful thing about Marxism is they don't believe in the economy. They don't even believe in the economy, the social system as a whole. Now, sometimes they get, as economists, into areas which cease to look like studying about economics. Well, that's one of their virtues. If you think that you're not a Marxist, but believe in that the economy is embedded in a social fabric matrix, which is historically contingent, then you have no idea what you're saying. If you think that's the case, then you draw from a Marxian tradition, as well as institutionalist tradition. You cannot say that you're not a Marxist, or influenced by a Marxian tradition. People like to do that because they're cheap because I'm a Marxist, I'm radical, nobody likes me, etc. Get over it. Do economics, become an economist, and do the best you damn well can. One final question?
Oh, okay. Is there an inherent, I guess, like epistemological problem with using mathematical models and engaging in the kind of really detailed historical and social
Absolutely
analysis?
not.
Schemas offer more flexibility in that regard?
Well, no. Use models where it's appropriate to construct mathematical equations to relate particular relation between inputs and outputs, etc. That's what if you think that one shouldn't be using this stuff in this kind of context, then you're wrong. That's part. The economy that we live in is made up of the world. And if you believe that there's no mathematics in the world, then I suggest that you go see a particle at the Tivoli when they talk, and where they basically said the physical universe, we're fortunate that can be represented through a set of mathematical equations. But it's the physical universe which enables that to happen. Our argument is that what happens in economics, we create a world of its own outside the real world, and therefore we can use any kind of mathematics. And mathematics must be controlled by the world itself. So the world is in part representable, our economic world is part represented by a set of mathematical equations or statistical equations. It's there. That's what the world is. It's also represented by a bunch of qualitative stuff, which are not representable by this particular fashion. The world is both. That's the virtue, wonder, and frustration of doing a social science such as economics. Our world is both. I prefer this to physics and engineering. So I think I've run out of time. Thank you for this one last lecture. Health does hold, I may try to come back in the fall a few times to lecture. But that's uncertain. I won't really know that until early June when they evaluate my chemotherapy and see how well it's doing or not. Hopefully it's doing well enough that I can make it to the post-Keynesian conference, because apparently a hell of a lot of people are showing up because of me. I have to be disposed at this time.